Hello everyone, Drogger VT here, and today we're going to be doing my first sleep aid video, and I'm going to be doing alphabetical order of planes from the interwar period. For those of you that don't know, that means the time from November 11th of 1918 through September 1st of 1939. This period of time between World War I and II saw an explosion in technology, and specifically I want to focus on the planes during that time period. So, let's start off with British Armstrong Whitworth AW-35 Scimitar. The Scimitar was actually a bit of a kept secret, as only 6 were produced. Let's talk specs before we get into the history. This plane experienced its first flight in 1935, a 1 crew member biplane. It was 25 feet in length, 33-foot wingspan, 12 foot in height. Its wings area took up to 261.3 square foot, while empty it weighted of 2,956 pounds, powered by a 14-cylinder twin-row air-cooled radial engine originally called the Armstrong Jaguar Major. The engine was renamed to the Armstrong Panther, a much better naming choice in my opinion. This plane clocked out around 221 speed and 306,000 altitude. My mistake, 31,600 altitude. With time to get peak altitude 5 minutes and 15 seconds. On board for weapons were 2 Vickers machine guns chambered in 303 British. This was considered a failed plane with only 6 produced. Norway cancelled its contract after discovering that the Scimitar was not prepared for the amount of snow. Now for the Armstrong Whitworth Siskin. This plane has had a lot of change, therefore I am leaving it as just the Siskin. It's actually our first chunky history. It was originally called the Armstrong Whitworth Siddeley Easy SR2 due to the Siddeley Easy Motor Company engine called the ABC Dragonfly radial engine. The first flight was May of 1919. It was a single biplane made with wood and fabric. A single crew biplane standing at 25 feet in length, 33 foot and 2 inches of wingspan, 10 feet 2 inches of height. Its empty weight sitting at 2,061 pounds. Its max speed at a relatively slow 156 miles per hour. While it was weight only able to get 27,000 altitude, it only took 7 minutes and 5 seconds to reach the altitude from the ground up. The weapons available is 2 Vickers 303 as per normal, and interestingly 4 slots for 20-pound bombs. After its first flight, it was discovered that the ABC Dragonfly engine was not going to work out, as it was not producing the horsepower promised and had a bad habit of overheating. In 1921, they replaced it with the Armstrong Jaguar, and the engine problems went away. In 1922, Major Green, the original designer, names the Armstrong Whitworth suddenly Siddeley DZ SR2 to the Armstrong Whitworth Skin 3, changed from a wood and fabric body to an all-metal body with the best, better engine. This was the start of the British transitioning to only metal aircraft. This was an okay plane, and order for more was placed and cancelled a few years later. It was cancelled due to the fatal accident while testing the planes, and it was clear it needed to be reworked. The Siskin Grebe was born. This model addressed the errors of the previous, and it was the majority of the 485 Siskins were. This was a beloved plane due to its easy handling and which allowed pilots to move new and exciting ways. The Siskin 3A was a fan favorite for flight expeditionists and by the Royal Air Force. While this was the favorite for many years, it retired in 1932, replaced by a new type of plane, the British Bulldog, we will talk about later. The Blackburn F1 Turcock has an interesting but short history. A single crew member biplane standing 24 feet and 4 inches in length, 31-foot wingspan, a relatively short 8 foot tall and 11 inches in tall. Its empty weight is 2,282 pounds, having the best engine of the time, Armstrong Jaguar. Its service ceiling set at 27,500 feet. This was originally named the Blackcock with Blackburn planning on making a new name per new design. It was later changed to the Blackburn F1 Turcock since the Turkish government was the only one to order an unarmed prototype. Its first flight was in November 1927, and its last flight was January 23rd of 1928, killing its pilot and the contract was cancelled. Now, the Blackburn F2 Lincock was marketed as the budget-friendly plane, a single crew member biplane standing at 19 feet 6 inches in length, 22 feet 6 inches wingspan, standing at 7 foot 4 inches. Its empty weight is 1,326 pounds. It tops out at 164 miles per hour with a service ceiling of 23,000 feet. The weapons were the usual two 303 British Vickers machine guns. The powerhouse was an Armstrong steadily linked major, a 7-cylinder radial air-cooled engine. This plane did well in demonstrations, but it was a wooden plane with a small engine. It never made it to contract, but only a few countries purchased one, so ultimately only 6 were produced. Interestingly, during this time, most planes had slots for bombs, and the Linecock was different. It only had the two Vickers machine guns. Other planes at this time were metal, large engines, and space for bombs, which just made the cost-effective Linecock not worth the small price tag. The plans for the plane were later sold to Italy, who made a two-seater advanced trainer. Now it is the Blackburn F3, aka the F730. This is a failed prototype fighter plane. It never had a first flight due to engine problems. One crew member biplane, standing at 27 feet in length, 36 feet, 10.75 inches in wingspan. At 1 foot tall, it is our heaviest plane, yet at 2,500 pounds. Empty, a new engine in this episode, the Rolls-Royce Gashawk, a V12, meaning that the pistons were in a V shape instead of a radial engine we've been talking about. This was a prototype engine designed to be steam cooled. The coolant was allowed to boil to remove heat, similar to a way human bodies switch to remove heat. There were only 20 of this engine, built for good reason. It was promised to produce 650 miles per hour, but it was only able to do 180 miles per hour at its fastest. This was the downfall of the Blackburn F3. The engine had constant coolant leaks and would overheat. There are a few other things I would like to note about the F3. The weapons were 4 Vickers 303 British, synchronized to fire one after another in a smooth stream of bullets. The other thing I would like to talk about is the design of the plane. Imagine a modern day plane with wings in the middle, followed by 2 more wings underneath the middle wings. This is what was notable about the F3. It was made to let the pilot have complete view overhead and around him, with wings purposefully built below the pilot's view. It's an interesting design, and I'm curious what would happen if the F3 had a good engine and not a failed prototype. And now the Blackburn 2F.1 Nautilus. This is a fun one. While the Blackburn Nautilus is a first that we'll be talking about in this video, it was a 2 crew member prototype plane. It stood at 31 feet 8 inches in length with a 36-foot 10.75-inch wingspan, standing tall at 10 feet 10 inches. In the landing area, it was a 458 square foot. Its empty weight at 3,223 pounds. The engine, a Rolls-Royce FX2NS, popping out at 154 miles per hour with a service ceiling of 18,800 feet. This is also the first plane with 2 different machine guns. It had a forward-facing 303 Vickers and a rear-mounted 303 Lewis. The aluminum fabric covered plane was designed to be a spotter and a naval aircraft carrier. This was never went to major contract because of delays with craftiness. It didn't inspire a lot of other planes, but the original just never became what it should have been. It was designed with more of a point than most other planes we have talked about. The engine was a Rolls-Royce FX2MS, also known as the Kestrel. This was an improved version of the Gas Hog talked about in the last plane. Why did this one work and the other failed? The Kestrel had a pressurized cooling system. Instead of allowing the water to boil over a pressure system, meant that it boiled at higher temperatures, allowing the water to cool the engine for longer. The Kestrel was actually a very well-made engine, and planes with this engine can sometimes be flyable to this day. And now, the Blackburn Skua. This is going to be our first fighter slash bomber we're going to talk about today. The Blackburn Skua has a notable history and design I'm excited to talk about. The 2 crew member plane took its first flight on February 9th of 1937. It stood at 35 feet 7 inches in length with 46 feet 2 inches in wingspan at its largest. 12 feet 6 inches for height, 319 square foot wing area, 5,496 pounds in empty weight, but 8,228 pounds. With all gear, its engine is a Bristol Perseus X2 with a max speed of 225 miles per hour. Its service ceiling is at 20,200 feet. Its fighter weapons: 4 303 Browning machine guns, a rear-facing 303 Vickers, the bomber side slot for a 500-pound bomb under the body, and finally, a slot for 30-pound bombs underneath the wings. Now that we had the specs out of the way, I will start from the body of the plane and move on to history. The plane named it after the predatory bird of the same name. It's known to dive bomb to obtain food. There was a need for fighters and dive bombers for naval vessels, which made that with limited space, designers were tasked with mixing a fighter and a bomber and limiting as much space as possible. The result was this plane that had an interesting feature. Besides its weapons, the wings of the plane could fold backwards, allowing 2 or 3 planes to sit in the same area as one. These were previewed and shown to countries and immediately went into contract. There were some changes. The prototype plane had a Bristol Mercury engine, an air-cooled 9-cylinder radial engine, but that engine was prioritized for another plane. So the engine used was a Bristol Perseus, a similar 9-cylinder radial engine. Now to the history. The Skua was known for its dive bomb ability, and notably, It was involved in the sinking of German cruiser Koenigsberg, the first big warship sunk by dive bombers. Now on to the Blackburn Roc. The Blackburn Roc was supposed to be the Skua's successor. It was supposed to be a bigger, better, stronger plane. It was not. Its first flight was December 23rd, 1938. With nearly identical stats of the Skua, it was a two crew member plane standing at 35 feet 7 inches in length, 46-foot wingspan, 12 foot tall, 1 inches, with a wing area of 310 square foot. Its empty weight was 6,121 pounds, but it was 7,950 pounds with gear. The power plant was the same Bristol Perseus, but only 223 miles per hour, and with a service ceiling of only 18,000 feet. The weapons were Browning 303 machine guns, and finally, 8 slots for 30-pound bombs. This was heavier, sluggish, less weapons, and harder to maneuver, according to the pilots. So why did this even go to contract for 136 planes? It was innovative that the 4 Browning 303 machine guns were mounted in a turret. This turret allowed the second crew member to turn all the way around in order to shoot enemy planes, with a stopper to prevent the tail or propeller from being shot off. This was a huge new innovation that worked great on paper. Once the plane was crafted, it was clear it wasn't going to outdo the Skua. Pilots actually specifically requested to not fly the Roc. It eventually became a search and rescue plane, on an air towing plane, and finally, when the engines failed, they were landed and parked in strategic areas on land to be anti-aircraft guns. Most definitely not the bigger and better Skua it was hoped to be. And now for the Bristol Bulldog. Alright, now on to the Bristol F2 Fighter. The Bristol F2 Fighter, also called the Brisfit or even just Biff, was the old reliable of the British Air Force. This one plane was used for 11 years, which was a very long time in the innovative time for aviation. This two crew member biplane stood at 25 feet 10 inches in length, 39 feet 3 inches in wingspan, 9 feet 9 inches tall, 405 square feet wing area, 2,145-pound empty weight. Its best engine was the Rolls-Royce Falcon, a V-shaped 12-cylinder engine with a max speed of 123 miles an hour, a service ceiling of 18,000 feet. For weapons, it had a forward-facing 303 Vickers machine gun for its second crew member, one or two 303 Lewis machine guns, and slots to carry up to 240 pounds of bombs. This original engine was the Rolls-Royce Falcon, but as time went on and engines became in short supply, Bristol had to make a change. Biffs were later outfitted with Sunbeam Arab, a V8. This was obviously not as powerful, but it would have to do. The Royal Air Force began awarding the Falcon planes more important jobs and letting the airplanes handle more reconnaissance jobs. The problem was that the Arab engines suffered cylinder problems, cooling system errors, and the biggest of many problems, the engine would severely vibrate. Bristol ended up making so many modifications that the engines became the Bristol Arab for a while. Ford has decided that the Arabs were just not going to work. The Hispano Suiza V8 engine was the best replacement option. The problem was similar to the Rolls-Royce. These engines were in short supply. This led to each plane having any of the 8 different engine combinations. Another interesting design about the Biff that while it had the forward-facing 303 Vickers machine gun, the rear 303 Lewis machine gun would be mounted on a ring around the second cockpit. If there were a second Lewis gun, it would be on a Foster mount, which if you didn't know, would allow a large machine gun like the Lewis to shoot over the propellers and not through. Some pilots like to spout as it would allow the Lewis to shoot directly up and would allow a pilot to shoot an enemy from the bottom. During this time, shooting the propeller or tail was a big problem. This mount seemed to be the answer, but it was not always the best, and other better options would come later. The over 5,000 BIFs that were produced in the 11 years of service also had a notable science experiment in its history. This plane was the first to test out radio communications between planes in the air. The flight commander would have the transmitter, and the other planes would have receivers. This way, orders could be communicated between planes immediately. Now, onto the Bristol Bulldog. The Bristol Bulldog is what most people think of when they hear British biplanes. This was a hugely popular plane. Its first flight was May 17th, 1927, a one crew member plane standing at 25 feet 2 inches in length, 33 feet 10 inches wingspan, 8 feet 9 inches tall, 307 square foot wing area. Its empty weight was 2,205 pounds with a 9-cylinder radial engine. The Bristol Jupiter with a max speed of 178 miles an hour, 29,300 feet service ceiling. It had the usual 2 Vickers machine guns and 4 slots for 20-pound bombs. I will start with the engine before I talk about the reasons why pilots loved the plane. The Bristol Jupiter had a long list of upgrades, which made it the perfect and best engine of the time. These were cheap to make, highly maneuverable, and once the pilot learned how to handle its spin, became a huge favorite. This one plane made up to 70% of the Royal Air Force during the interwar period. The Bulldog was only replaced due to the age of planes. It was bittersweet for the pilots. Walking away from a beloved plane was hard, but the new and shiny Gloster Gauntlet was waiting for them. Now for the Fairey Firefly. This plane has a short history, which is not surprising when you consider that only 9 were made. A single crew member biplane, standing at 24 feet 8 inches in length, 31 feet 6-inch wingspan, 9 feet 4 inches tall, 236.8 square foot wingspan. Its empty rate was 2,387 pounds. The power plant was the known engine, a Rolls-Royce Kestrel. Its max speed was 175 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 30,800 feet. Finally, the weapons, the usual 2 303 Vickers machine guns. This plane was initially better than the competition due to the great speed. It was unfortunately just not a feasible option, as the wooden structure of the plane struggled with the size and weight of the Kestrel engine. The other problem was the Royal Air Force was requesting all metal planes, and therefore a wooden structure did not make the cut. It was replaced by the Hawker Fury, which we will talk about later on. Now, time for the Fairey Flycatcher. This plane is one of the first aircraft carrier planes and had an interesting fun fact. We will talk about that after the specs. This one crew member biplane stands at 23 feet in length, 29-foot wingspan, 12 foot tall, 288 square feet, 2,038 pounds of empty weight. The power plant started as the Armstrong Jaguar and was later changed to the Bristol Jupiter. Its max speed was 133 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 19,000 feet. Finally, the usual two forward-facing 33 Vickers and four bomb slots. This plane had the ability to take off and land in 50 yards of deck space. For reference, that is half a football field. Most biplanes of this time need 300 yards for takeoff and landing. It had an arrest hook, which was a hook that would catch a rope on the carrier ship to slow it down as quickly as possible. The body plane had the ability to be split in two for storage. Finally, the Flycatcher was equipped to be an amphibian plane. It could be outfitted with floats or even wheels and floats to allow for water and air use. Finally, the last fun fact about this plane is that it was the first plane to land on a carrier ship at night. The Flycatcher was later replaced with the Nimrod, which we will talk about later. Now for the Gloster Gamecock. This plane has an unfortunate name. I am not entirely sure why some names are epic and others are Gamecock. This was a one crew member plane standing at 19 feet 8 inches in length, 29 foot 9.5-inch wingspan, 9 foot 8-inch tall, 264 square foot wing area. The empty weight was 1,930 pounds. The power plant, a Bristol Jupiter, which we have talked about before, but once again, it's a 9-cylinder radial engine. Its max speed was 155 miles per hour with a service ceiling of 22,100 feet. Finally, the weapons were the usual 303 Vickers. Now that the specs are out of the way, the Gamecock's first flight was February 22nd, 1925. It was originally a plan to improve upon a different design, specifically the Armstrong Jaguar, which is also a common engine at this time, has shown its flaws. It became unreliable, and engine crews complained about how difficult it was to service. So, with a new list of wants, the Gloster Gamecock was born. The more notable changes was, of course, the Bristol Jupiter, a much smaller engine that was also more simple to work on. The other notable improvement was the 303 Vickers were now internal instead of mounted on an armament arrangement. This plane was beloved by the pilots who flew it, as they said it was beautifully maneuverable and fast. While it was only used by the Royal Air Force for 5 years, it was so loved that Squadron 43 named themselves the Fighting Cocks after their favorite Gamecock. Now, the problem with the Gamecock was that it had a problem with the flutter and accidents. With 90 planes in service, 22 were down, so the Royal Air Force moved on to another plane, and the Finnish Air Force ended up taking a liking to the Gamecock. And other notables, the Finnish Gamecock, called a cuckoo, Finnish for rooster, was the oldest plane evolved in World War II to claim a kill. Imagine getting killed by the cock. Alright, now for the Gloster Gauntlet. This plane, while only 246 were built, spent a long time on the drawing board. It paid off as it was the best plane in the Royal Air Force for nearly 10 years. The one crew biplane, standing at 26 feet 5 inches in length, 32 feet 9.5 inches wingspan, 10 foot tall, 3 inches and 315 square foot wing area. The empty weight of 2,770 pounds. The power plant of Bristol Mercury. a top speed of an insane 230 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 33,500 feet, and finally, as per usual, two 303 Vickers machine guns. The Gauntlet first began as a prototype SS-18, a basic plane with nothing to write home about. The next version, SS-19, was outfitted to hold six Vickers machine guns, but it was heavy and slow. The SS-19A went through radical changes, became lighter and therefore faster. It lost the extra machine guns, but it reached incredibly fast 204 miles per hour. The SS-19B modified a few more things. It got to 212 miles per hour. Another tweak of it using the Bristol Mercury, a 9-cylinder engine with a top speed of 230 miles per hour. The SS-19B became the Gauntlet I. It became a favorite for its amazing speed, and it replaced the Bristol Bulldog in 1933. The final iteration of the Gauntlet came after Hawker, a well-known plane builder, bought Gloster. With this change, Hawker added some much-needed structural additions, which gave us Gauntlet 2, the most perfect plane. At the time, it was fast and easy to fly. Sadly, as with most planes that were once perfect, new technology came along and made the Gauntlet obsolete. This was the last open-air plane that had produced for the Royal Air Force. Alright, now for the Gloster Gladiator. This plane has a few notable body modifications and then a long battle history. But first, the specifications. The one crew member biplane stood at 27 feet 5 inches in length, 32 feet 3-inch wingspan, 11 foot 9 inches tall, 232 square foot wing area, 3,217 pounds of empty weight. The power plant, a Bristol Mercury. The speed of 253 miles per hour with a service ceiling of 32,800 feet. The weapons this time depended on the version, but the majority had two 303 Vickers machine guns, two 303 Lewis machine guns mounted under the wings. In other versions, two 303 Browning machine guns under the wings, equaling 6 guns in totals. Now, to talk about the modifications. The Gladiator's basics are an improved gauntlet. The first flight was February 23rd, 1937, as a prototype SS-37. This prototype was the first plane in the Royal Air Force to have an enclosed cockpit. The original request for a new plane included a strong push for the Rolls-Royce Goshawk, a V-12 aerial engine. The request Gloster ignored due to Goshawk's difficulty of maintenance and failed cooling system. They instead inserted a Bristol Mercury 9-cylinder radial engine. This was a proven engine and was the best design possible as prototype at a max speed of 243 miles per hour. The Gladiator was the perfect mix of Hawker machinery and Gloster Gauntlet design. This led to the nickname the Super Gauntlet, as this plane became the perfect version of the previous Gauntlet. It was also later modified into the Sea Gladiator. The changes were minimal, two 303 Browning machine guns, which meant 6 guns in total, and a resting hook to allow the plane to slow quickly on the carrier ship, and a place for an inflatable raft. By all means, this plane design was pushed to the absolute limits that it could, which also meant that the Gladiator was the last biplane to serve in the Royal Air Force. It was never looked down on, with just shy of 750 planes produced. Served its time well in the Royal Air Force alone. 8 squadrons were proud to fly these planes. It became involved in China, Finland, Norway, Belgium, the Middle East, North Africa, East Africa, Greece, Iraq, and Syria from 1937 to 1953. This plane was used for all it was worth. A particular note that sticks out to me is the Gladiator Food 27. While 7 of the Gladiators fought the German invasion, they managed to take down 5 enemy planes, while the Germans killed 3 of the Gladiators. Remaining 4 were ordered to land wherever they could and abandon their planes. The Gladiator 427 landed on a frozen lake and was torn apart by scavengers. Gladiator N5628, one of the 3 planes that was shot down, is currently on display in a museum of what's left of it. Finally, I would like to mention that in 1940, when the German forces tried to invade the small island of Malta, 3 gladiators called Faith, Hope, and Charity were sent out against a full squadron. There was no hope, but maybe these 3 planes could slow the Germans at least. Instead, the gladiators were able to completely defend their small island and return home despite all odds. Alright, time for the Gloster Grebe and the Gloster Nightjar. First, the Gloster Glebe. This plane doesn't have a long history as the last, but it served its purpose. First, the specifications. Its first flight was somewhere in 1923. The single crew member biplane stood at 20 feet, 3 inches in length, 29 foot, 4-inch wingspan, the 9 foot 3 inches tall, 254 square foot wing area. The empty weight was 1,720 pounds. The power plant, an Armstrong Jaguar with max speed of 152 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 23,000 feet. Finally, as per usual, 2 Vickers machine guns. This plane was meant to be faster and more agile than the Sopwith Snipe. British plane, a little too old for this discussion. The Grebe was indeed better than the Snipe, but it suffered from wing flutter, which was later resolved by adding additional support. It did not help that the Armstrong Jaguar had a bad habit of bursting into flames occasionally. The reality was from the Grebe introduction in 23 to its retirement in 1938. It was a solid plane that was very good at being nothing particularly special. This was actually the base model for the Gamecock was built from. While only 133 were built, they were loved by the pilots who flew them. And now for the Gloster Nightjar. This plane was a mishmash from a closed company and then changed to a Gloster Nightjar. First specs. This one crew member biplane stood at 19 foot 2 inches and 28-foot wingspan, 9 foot 7 inch tall, 270 square foot wing area, 1,765 of empty weight. Its power plant was a Bentley BR2 with a max speed of 120 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 19,000 feet. Finally, as per usual, 2 Vickers 303 machine guns. The Nightjars were originally from the Newport Nighthawk. The Newport and General built the Nighthawk with the ABC Dragonfly radial engine as the plan. The problem came in because the Dragonfly was just a bad engine, and the Newport and General closed in August of 1920. This left 22 Nighthawks half built, while the warehouse for Gloster bought out the company and finished the Nighthawks. But since they made so many improvements, they changed the name to the Nightjar and specifically gave it the Bentley BR2 engine. Those 22 Nightjars served for 2 years before being replaced by the Fairey Flycatcher. Now time for the Hawker Fury. For only have 275 planes made, the Hawker Fury made quite the impression. First, the specs. This one crew member biplane stood at 26 feet 9 inches in length, 30-foot wingspan, 10 foot 2 inches tall, 252 square foot wing area, 2,734 pounds of empty weight. The power plant, the Rolls-Royce Kestrel, with a max speed of 223 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 29,500 feet. Finally, the weapons are the usual two 303 Vickers machine guns. Its first flight was March 25th, 1931, as the prototype called the Hawker Hornet. The Royal Air Force liked the prototype, but it did not like the name. It wanted fighters to sound ferocious to help inspire the men, so the name was changed to Fury. It was the first fighter to exceed 200 miles per hour in service to the Royal Air Force. The Fury was designed to specifically go after bombers with its ability to reach 10,000 feet in under 5 minutes. I would like to mention that the 43rd Squadron, aka Fighting Cocks, were able to fly the Fury until they were later replaced. The next version of Fury was supposed to be even faster, nicknamed High Speed Fury, but it was failed by the Rolls-Royce Crosshawk engine. Some features of the High Speed Fury were converted to the next plane, the Hawker Hurricane. This one is going to be a long one, so buckle in and let's get to the specs. The Hawker Hurricane's first flight was November 6, 1935. The one crew member monoplane. It only had one set of wings, stood at 32 feet, 3 inches in length, 40-foot wingspan, 13 feet, 1.5 inches tall, 257.5 square foot wing area, 5,745 pounds of empty weight. The power plant, a Rolls-Royce Merlin, with a max speed of 340 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 36,000 feet. Finally, the weapons were four 20mm Hispano Mark II cannon and 2 slots for 450 to 500-pound bombs. Now, the history of development. So, the Air Ministry was looking for the next big thing, and while the high-speed Fury failed, it gave Sidney Cam an idea, a monoplane with everything that worked for the Fury. The prototype was called a Fury monoplane with a failed Goshawk engine. It was reworked and called the Interceptor monoplane. The complete plan was presented to the Air Ministry, who simply said, "Ew, an old metal monoplane." Kane was understandably pissed, as he knew this was the future. He reworked it again and changed the Goshawk engine to a much better Merlin. The engine was able to actually cool itself and put out a crazy 1,000 horsepower in its early days. This let the prototype Interceptor monoplane reach that 300 miles per hour the Air Ministry had wanted. Ham wanted to prove without a shadow of a doubt that this was the plane the Air Ministry wanted. So he made a 1/10 scale plane and sent it off to the National Physical Laboratory to do wind tunnel tests and prove that it was aerodynamic. Ham bought his information, and the Air Ministry promptly ordered the prototype. The Hurricane was faster and cheaper to make than the Spitfire, which we'll talk about later. The Hurricane only took 10,300 hours to put together compared to the Spitfire's 15,200 hours. This made the Hurricane the perfect available everywhere, good but not perfect to fly type of plane. It definitely needed training on how to fly, and it's not smooth. It apparently required some serious muscle to push and pull the control stick for the Hurricane to listen. I will say at the beginning of World War II, the Hurricane was ready and willing to heed the call. Many early battles were won or nearly won with the help of the Hurricane. My researcher, Mrs. Cozy, would like to also make sure that it is noted that Winfred Crossley Fair was the first woman to fly a Hurricane. She was known as part of the first eight, a group of women in the 1940s to be hired by the Air Transport Auxiliary. Their job was to fly planes from the factories to the bases and broken planes back to the factories. Also a rarity for the first time, these women were paid the exact same amount as their male equivalents. The Hurricane was also a great night fighter during World War II, as it was fairly easy to fly and would shoot down German bombers on night raids. Later, the Sea Hurricane was made from beat-up originals. These planes needed over 800 modifications to make them good sea carrier planes. While many were lost in these modification efforts, the ones that survived were very well loved. Now time for the Hawker Nimrod and Woodcock. The Nimrod is actually my favorite plane simply because of the name. How could you not love with Nimrod? Let's get into the specs. His first flight was October 14th, 1931. This one crew member biplane stood at 26 feet, 6 inches in length, 33 foot, 7 inches in wingspan, 9 foot, 10 inch tall, 300 square foot wing area, 3,110 pounds of empty weight. The power plant, a Rolls-Royce Kestrel with a max speed of 194 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 28,000 feet, and finally two Vickers 303 machine guns and 4 slots for 20-pound bombs. Now, all funny names aside, this was a naval plane designed to be better than what it replaced. The joke on naval carriers was that the Fairey Flycatcher was so slow that a real fly might actually beat the aircraft in a race. The Hawker stepped up to give the pilots a faster and nimble plane. The Nimrod had a max speed of 194 miles per hour compared to the Flycatcher's 133 miles per hour. This actually put it on the same level as its land counterpart, the Hawker Fury. While it wasn't the biggest or baddest plane, it was exactly what was needed. It served well until it was replaced with the Sea Gladiator. And now for the Hawker Woodcock. This plane has no big history, but it's still important nonetheless. Even if it's just our last funny named plane, let's talk about the specs. Its first flight was sometime in March of 1923. The one crew member biplane stood at 26 feet, 2 inches in length, 32 feet, 6 inch wingspan, 2,014 pounds of empty weight. The power plane was a Bristol Jupiter with a max speed of 141 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 22,500 feet, and finally, the usual two Vickers 303 machine guns. Now, onto a short history. The prototype was originally rejected due to lack of maneuverability, wing flutter, and ineffective rudder control. Immediately after, a different designer stepped in and changed the basic design, solving a lot of the initial problems and leading to the Woodcock being ordered by the Air Ministry. Only 64 were ordered in total, and it was simply just a good plane that rarely had a complaint until it was replaced by the Gamecock 5 years later. Other notable things about the Woodcock is that Charles Lindbergh flew a Woodcock on his way from Paris to London. Finally, the Woodcock entered into 1925 King Cup's air race. So, for the last plane, the Supermarine Spitfire. This is our last plane for this video, and of course, it's a long one. Most of you should be asleep by now, but the last few of you awake can enjoy this. The first flight was March 5th, 1936. This one crew member monoplane stood at 29 feet, 11 inches in length, 36 feet, 10 inches wingspan, 11 feet, 5 inches tall, 242.1 square foot wing area. 5,065 pounds of empty weight. The power plant was the Rolls-Royce Merlin with a max speed of 370 miles per hour, the fastest pre-war plane with a service ceiling of 36,500 feet. For the first time, there are actually 5 variants for weapons. The basics are Wing Type A had 8 303 Browning Mark II. Wing Type B had 2 20mm Hispano Mark II and 4 303 Browning Mark II. Wing Type C had 4 20mm Hispano Mark II. The alternative C had 2 20mm Hispano Mark II. Wing Type E had 2 20mm Hispano 250 cal into Browning machine guns. Finally, they all had slots for 2 RP-3 rockets. RP stands for Rocket Projectile 3-inch. It was an unguided air-to-surface rocket that weighed between 35 and 39 pounds. There is a pretty long design and development history for this plane, so bear with me. The Air Ministry in 1931 called for a plane to reach 250 miles per hour or better. Gloster submitted their design called the Gloster Gladiator, and the Supermarine submitted their design temporarily called Type 224. Supermarines Type 224 didn't even reach the minimum required speed at 240 miles per hour, and the Gladiator won the contract easily. The designer, R.J. Mitchell, was hugely disappointed and decided that the Air Ministry wasn't seeing the future of aviation. He buckled down and began changing the Type 224. The start was putting the Rolls-Royce Merlin in, then an enclosed cockpit, oxygen breathing apparatus, thinner wings, and finally spots for 8 303 Brownings. It was called Type 300. The Air Ministry was keeping a close eye on this future of aviation, and towards the design, they saw the vision and ordered a few test planes. Now that they had made it off the drawing board, Type 300 needed a real name. Mitchell put forward the name The Shrew. An apprentice in a room piped up and said, with a name like that, they've already lost the war. And the name Spitfire was chosen. The Royal Air Force was thrilled with the speed and maneuverability and promptly ordered 350 Spitfires, the largest single order for a plane. Unfortunately, the designer, R.J. Mitchell, would die shortly after receiving the order at age of 42 during due to cancer. The order was being built when the Nazis were actively bombing aviation buildings, which led to many deaths, but the order must be filled. So they built an underground facility to fill the order, and the next order for 200, and the next order. The Spitfire had a huge victory to loss ratio as pilots raved about the smooth turns, speed, and plenty of weapons, while the Hawker's Hurricane was the solid backup and foundation for a majority of victories. The Spitfire was the star of the show and the reason for breaking the lines to allow victories to even happen. Alright everyone, that is the end of the video. If you're awake at some point, please feel free to subscribe because in the future I plan on doing some more sleep aid videos. And I believe the next video is going to be about the German planes during the interwar period. So, if you like what you saw or slept through, like and subscribe. And this is Stronger VT signing out. Have a good night.